Welcome to this very special opportunity to honor Angela Hallstrom with the Association for Mormon Letters Lifetime Achievement Award. And we're joined by Angela Hallstrom herself and her friends and admirers, Lisa Olsen Tait and Darlene Young. Now, Angela Hallstrom will be hearing a lot about her. We have an award citation that we're going to be reading later at the award ceremony itself. But let me just remind you that she's a writer, editor, educator, and therapist who's been a key figure in Mormon literature, both through her own writing and her mentorship and guidance of other authors. For several years, she has taught English and composition at high schools and universities. She served as the features and fiction editor at AML's literary journal, Iriantum, and was given the AML Special Award for Service in 2006 after she stepped up and after the sudden death of one of our editors. She served as one of the head editors of Iriantum for several years, and then served on the editorial boards of Journal Sigala and BYU Studies Quarterly. She received AML awards for her wonderful novel, Bound on Earth, and for her collection of short fiction, Dispensation, Latter-day Fiction, and is just a wonderful person, and is also a great writer of history. So, we're going to have these two friends and admirers. So first, Darlene Young, who is an instructor in the English department at Brigham Young University, and also Lisa Olsen Tait, who's the manager of women's history at the church history department. So Darlene, could you start us off with some questions?
Sure. I'm so excited to do this. Angela and I go back a few years,
Quite a long way.
a
So,
couple of years. Yeah.
couple years.
Just say I used to have a different color hair when I met Angela. Um,
Not my hair has always been this color.
Angela is a dear friend, but also she has been a great mentor to me and a cheerleader to my work. And I'm so glad I have the opportunity to cheer for her and this well-deserved award. As I went back through the sort of questions I wanted to ask her about and the things I thought would be interesting to talk to her about, I was just amazed at all the things you have done, Angela, in writing and editing and in many aspects of the LDS literature community. I'm super excited to get a chance to showcase this. So
Thanks.
I'm going to talk to you a little bit about, or get you to talk to us a little bit about your life as a writer, and especially the early years. And I think that would be a good place to segue over to Lisa talking about the writing you've done on the Saints Project and in the church history department. And then I'll come back and talk to you some more about your editing and other things that you've done. Does that sound good?
That sounds great.
Okay, so let's start way back in the Dark Ages to where it all began. What would you say was the time when you first began to think of yourself as a writer?
As a child, I liked to write. I my first memory actually of even being a writer, wanting to be a writer, is with my great grandmother. So my great grandmother, Mary Leona Johnson Jolly, she was born in Tropic, Utah in 1888. She lived to be, I think, 96. And so I knew her as a child. And I knew that she was a poet. And I had this vivid memory of going to visit her in this little house that they, at least in my mind, it was this kind of small house that she lived in that was up kind of in the Harvard Yale area. And that she was sitting like wrapped in her little Afghan and had me come over and said, come over. And she said, I hear that you like to write. And I said, yes, I like to write. And I just remember her grabbing my hand and saying, keep writing, keep writing. And just as a little girl, that meant a lot to me. And mostly I wrote, not very good poetry, like all of us who are interested in language do when we're little. And I read a ton. But I didn't start trying to write fiction, I would say, until I was in high school. And even then it was pretty bad, but you have to start somewhere. So that's really when I started being interested in writing fiction. But I never thought that I would really be able to go anywhere with it.
So what made you feel like fiction was your thing more than poetry?
You know, I think I think part of it is I'm better at it. truly. I think that there is a certain talent that you have, Darlene, for being concise that I do not have. Um, it's hard for me even in prose to be as concise as I need to be. So I think that's my biggest struggle with poetry. And I just like stories also. At the end of the day, I really like language, but what I'm mostly drawn to is stories, is people, stories about people. And that's kind of a through line in all the variety of choices I've made in my adult life about what I want to do for a living. But stories about people, that's really what interests me.
Yeah, I agree with you. I really feel like one of the differences between poetry and fiction is that fiction takes place over time and it follows very specific people, their choices,
Hmm.
their consequences,
Yeah.
and their
Yeah.
interactions. And that's one of the
Yeah.
things I love about your work is that we can tell you have great affection for your characters, all
Mhm.
different characters. There's affection for the protagonist, but the other people, the bad guys, the people that they're pushing against, I also see compassion and empathy for that too, as you follow each one through their choices and their consequences. I love that about your work, and just a really tenderness about taking on each character's point of view as you write.
Mhm.
I love that. Yeah, I
Mhm.
think you're a fiction writer. You
Yeah.
definitely have the
And
talent.
I think the other thing too I like about fiction is I'm kind of a chicken when it comes to memoir and autobiography. And so it's a little easier to hide behind fiction and not have to put my own story out there quite as much. So there's
Okay.
that.
So, at what point did you start thinking you wanted to get a little more serious about this instead of it just being a fun hobby?
So what I went to BYU, majored in English, was decided to be an English teacher because it was practical. Um, I wrote a little bit here and there, and I had one short story that got published in the New Era, which is terrible, by the way. It, but I was so excited that it got published in the New Era. But that was really like I was like, very cool. I have a short story that was published one time. I didn't have any really great ambition to become a fiction writer beyond just dabbling in it. Then we moved to Minnesota. I had been a high school teacher, but I had two little kids, moved to Minnesota, and I was truly, really, really needing an outlet. I had two little kids. My husband was gone all the time. He was in graduate school and I wasn't. So I was also very jealous that he got to be in graduate school and I didn't. Um, and there was a program called the Loft Literary Center that you could take classes. And so I just said, I need to get out of the house. I need to do at least something. So I took this writing class at the Loft. And it was an autobiography class, actually, but it was great and I loved it. And they had an affiliation with Hamlin University, which was they had a master's program. And it was the one that I was initially interested in was a master's program in liberal studies, which was more just you can learn about art, literature. It's actually a fantastically cool program. And I talked myself into it because it's like, okay, well, if I go back to teaching high school, then I'll have a master's degree, so maybe I'll get paid more. But truly, it was I have got to get out of the house and stimulate my mind. So I went to the master's. I took the first course that's like an introductory course that you don't have to actually be admitted to take it, which was also kind of cool. So I took that course, and the instructor of that course was in the MFA program for creative writing. And she read some of the work that I'd done, and it said, are you interested in the creative writing program? And I was like, well, yeah, but there's no way I'd get in. Like, there's no way I'd get in. And she just said, I think you might get in. So that's what made me try. And I got into the creative writing program, even though I very much doubted myself. And this is an experience that I've had over and over in my life, which is we imagine, and I think women do this more than men. I don't want to be overly gendered, but we imagine all these spaces that we don't belong in, that we just don't think we quite have what it takes, or that it's for other people who are these imaginary people who are so much better at things. And then you get into the space and you go, oh, like we're all just figuring this out. This is not a space just full of experts and me who doesn't know what I'm doing. We're all stumbling around together. And that was a really good opportunity for me to do that. So being in that MFA program, first of all, it was such a fantastic program, and I got to just take one class at a time. So I had little kids. I took one class at a time. I had fantastic professors that I'm still in contact with. They're still friends of mine. Um, and got the opportunity to really slowly learn how to be a writer. And I loved every minute of it. And it helped me to realize that this is part of what I truly want to do with my time here on this planet, is to be able to communicate with people using language somehow.
Did you ever, I mean, you and I are the same generation and grew up in the same church with the same rhetoric. Did you
Mhm.
ever have problems giving yourself permission to take yourself seriously in terms of a career?
Oh, absolutely. And I don't think I ever would have become a writer if I hadn't gotten into the MFA program. It was getting into the program allowed me to think of myself as a writer. I don't think I would have had the courage to try to be a writer without some kind of other authority saying, yeah, you officially get to claim this, which is an interesting thing as I look back on myself to kind of go like, that is so interesting that you needed that validation in order to really try. But yeah, I did.
I recognize that too. I just wonder what would have happened to an Angela Hallstrom in high school being told, hey, this is a gift, go ahead and pursue this full throttle from the beginning, you know?
I think I probably would have just dismissed it out of hand.
Okay, well, I'm glad things worked out the way they did then,
Me
because
too.
we have some great work now in the world. So, speaking of your time there at Hamlin, were you writing stories that were based in your LDS culture? And if so, how were those being received?
It was also the perfect opportunity for me to write the kind of stories that I wanted to write. This was the early 2000s that I was in this master's program out in Minnesota. And, before Mitt Romney ran for president or the Book of Mormon musical or all those things that kind of made Mormonism more mainstream, kind of. And so I had people in that program with me who their immediate assumption was that I grew up Mormon or I used to be Mormon, and that I kind of came from this fascinating little cult that then I was going to write about my fascinating cult experiences that I have since distanced myself from. And it was a really interesting assumption to then confront and to have people slowly figure out that I was a practicing Latter-day Saint, or at the time I would have called myself a practicing Mormon. Um, and and see in some ways how the way that they saw me shifted when they figured that out. But on the other hand, there was a real openness I felt to my experience as kind of a cultural experience almost, that everybody was interested in a way that if I was going to school in Utah, either at the University of Utah or at BYU, my Mormonism would have had to have been a character, if you know what I mean. That I would either have to be arguing for it or against it in some kind of overt way. But when I was at Hamlin, it was just like, oh, this is just an interesting cultural background that can be there instead of having it be this like centerpiece. So
So
I'm
you
really grateful for that.
and you didn't feel that there were aspects of the stories you were writing that were hard for them to understand, not having the same cultural background?
You know, yes and no, because while there were certain specifics they didn't understand, I think that is why literature is so important, is it allows us, if we're willing to transport ourselves into other people's world. And because I wasn't arguing for it in any way, it was just part of the experience. I don't think that there was this kind of defensive way of approaching it. And instead, it would just be like, if I'm reading a Jhumpa Lahiri story, and it's like, oh, that's really fascinating, and I don't understand everything about that culture, but I can still try to charitably go with that setting.
I think that kind of a strategy is what we've all, and by we I mean the people who've been interested in Mormon letters for years, have been hoping for the great American novel that's going to come out. Sort of
Yeah,
yeah, if Jhumpa Lahiri can do it about her culture, or Khayyam Potak can do it about his,
yeah.
that we can
Mhm.
write stories about being human that
Mhm.
happen to take place within a specific culture. But
Yeah.
you do have some stories. I'm thinking of, I can't remember the name of it now, but one in which one of your characters feels like she might have been visited by one of the Nephites or an
Mhm.
angelic messenger or something like that. Did you ever feel in class that you had to stop and explain, hey, let me tell you some background for this story?
I think there were probably times in workshop where I would explain a little bit, but I also think that mystical experiences are common to all kinds of cultures. And so that I think the only time I ever felt like I had to really explain my Mormonism was more when it came up in the context of uh, like what was going on in the world. So we had a visiting professor once who she was Native American and started talking a little bit about some really offensive things that some LDS missionaries had said in her presence about how if they joined the church, then they would turn white, for example. And it was a very, very uncomfortable place for me because she didn't know. She was a visiting professor. She didn't know that I was LDS. And she was telling the truth.
Yeah.
Like that was part of the problem. She was telling the truth. And I could tell like there were people who were kind of looking at me like, okay, is this real? Are you going to refute it? And at the time I think I was maybe 28 or 29 years old. So trying to figure out how to both acknowledge that she was telling the truth and then also say, but this is not what I believe. This is not. And I remember trying to stumble through it and not doing a very good job at it. And then after everybody left, I went into the bathroom and just cried. So I remember that.
I have never heard that story before, but as you were telling
Yeah.
it, I was thinking about how having to negotiate this maybe contributed to some of the maturity and perspective that you had to have in order to do the work you did with the church history department later, of being
Possibly.
able to hold in your hand, there are some difficult things,
Mhm.
and I need to tell a story that is faithful and faith promoting and also true.
Mhm.
That you had to negotiate with these things as a young person
Yeah.
and then
Yeah,
make
and it's definitely it is easier when I'm just writing fiction as Angela Hallstrom than it is when I was trying to write narrative nonfiction that was published by the church, which that also puts you in a different space. So, yeah.
yeah. Okay. Well, so you did your master's program and you came out with a bunch of stories. And
Mhm.
then what did you decide to do with them?
So I decided as my thesis, I put them all together as a novel in stories, which eventually became my novel Bound on Earth. But it went through a bunch of different evolutions, even after it was my master's thesis.
So talk about the process of deciding that was a book and choosing to make it be a novel in story structure and then looking for and finding a publisher.
Okay. Um, the first thing was, I think one of the best classes that I took in my whole master's program was a point of view class, taught by Sheila O'Connor, who's just a fantastic writer and professor. I loved that class and learning what it means to write from different points of view in a technical way but also what it means to truly try to inhabit different points of view. And how do we do that technically and truly in a way that makes us feel like we know these characters as individuals? Um, so I had written probably my best known story from Bound on Earth and that's been published is Thanksgiving. And I wrote Thanksgiving in that class. And the family that kind of came to me as I was writing that story was just the family that I wanted to stay with. But I wanted to stay with each of them as individuals. And I was also just interested in this idea, and it's a very Mormon idea of what does it mean to be a family and what is an eternal family, meaning these connections that span generations, that span different ways of being in the world, and how do they all layer on top of each other and impact each other in our in a very daily life. You know, the novel itself is not super plot driven in that, you know, there's no vampires or jewelry heists or anything, you know, that's going on. It's just it's a novel about what it means truly to just be in a family. And I felt like the best way to do that would be in a multiple point of view novel and stories kind of format.
Okay, so you got this put together and then you decided you're going to try to get this published. Did you
Mhm.
try some national publishers?
No, I didn't even try because it was too inside baseball. I knew it was too inside baseball. Um, and I'd had a few stories that were published in Dialogue and in Iriantum. Um, and I knew that Zarahemla was publishing at the time fiction. And so Chris Bigelow loves this story. Actually, Zarahemla is like now publishes Bound on Earth, but at the time I had taken it to Chris Bigelow and one of his editors read through it and it was like, I don't think that this is a novel. I think I just want to publish it as I want to publish a few stories, like in a compilation with other stories. And it was really hard for me because I wanted things to be published, but I really wanted it to be one thing. I wanted it to be a book. And so I said no. And so then I went to Parables, which was another small independent LDS publisher with Beth. Oh my goodness, I'm forgetting her last name. Do you remember her last name, Darlene?
Bentley.
Thank you, Andrew.
Sure.
The voice.
Menopause brain, the first thing to go in my menopause brain is names. It's just, okay. So Beth, yeah, Elizabeth Petty Bentley. So
Are-
Beth was running Parables. And so I submitted it to her and she accepted it. And I have to say, she was a fantastic line editor, really good. I really valued that. She made my prose better, and I appreciated that a lot. So then it ended up being published through Parables.
is Parable still publishing? Do you know? Are they
No.
still
Mhm.
publishing?
And I
I
think that's why Zarahemla was able to then take
take,
over.
yeah, but I bet Chris just was kicking himself once that came out. It was
I
like,
don't know.
dang, missed that. Yeah, I'm super glad it came out. And how was it received?
It was received surprisingly well. And again, it's still small potatoes in the grand scheme of things as far as I mean, it's no at this at the time that it came out, I had become friends with Ali Condi a little bit, and she had published some Deseret book, and even then, like the Deseret book ones, I didn't get picked up by Deseret book. Like those would sell more. Um, and I remember talking to Ali when she got the contract for Matched, and like that's like huge, you know. So my stuff was still just like boop, little, but within the community that I cared about, which was the Mormon literature community and Latter-day Saints who cared about literature and writing good stories about our experience. I felt like it was pretty well received among that group.
Yeah, speaking of pretty well received, I have to say that in 2008 it won the Association for Mormon Letters Award for novel. And I'm going to take just a second. I'm going to read this citation because I think the people who are listening to this interview need to hear this. The mission of the Association for Mormon Letters is to foster the production and promotion of quality literature by, for, and about Mormons. We have awarded many great novels that have been produced by Mormons, but many of them are not necessarily Mormon works. There couldn't be a more appropriate work for the AML to recognize than Bound on Earth by Angela Hallstrom. Here is great literature that is also Mormon literature. Hallstrom's Mormon characters have real problems, the kinds of struggles that everyone has regardless of religion, but they also have a Mormon worldview and they view their problems from a background of belief. Part of Hallstrom's genius lies in her ability to present this faithful background without either mockery or defensiveness, the way many of us feel about our own faith. With her unerring eye for situation and skillful use of varying points of view, Hallstrom expertly weaves the characters' faith into the stories in a way that makes their motivations clear and their faith believable. For its complex, well-crafted, and truthful look at Mormon life, the Association for Mormon Letters is pleased to present the 2008 award in the novel To Bound on Earth. Well deserved, I have to say. I'm not biased, but I am not biased. I read a lot of LDS literature and a lot of not LDS literature, and I think it is the best LDS book out there that's fiction. So, and I still teach Thanksgiving to my class every semester because I don't know a better example of shifting point of view. It's just fantastic work. And I am so proud to know the person who produced it. And I hope it continues to get some attention because it needs to be read. Okay, this is a good part. I think I'm going to stop talking to you about your writing for a little bit and turn the time over to Lisa so she can talk to you about your writing for the church. And then I'll come back and have more questions for you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Well, okay, I have to say, I have known Angela for probably about 30 years since the days of the AML list.
Mm-hmm.
Back when email was so cool and you just fire up your computer hoping someone had sent you a new message or whatever.
Lisa, I think all three of us with little kids at home were probably like in front of our big honking desktop computers waiting for the AML list messages in the morning.
It was a great place to be there for a while until
it was.
Until it wasn't. Yeah, but then we got acquainted for real when you came on board to work on Saints. So maybe you could just tell us a little bit about how you became involved with the Saints project and what interested you about doing it, because it's a little bit of a departure from what you had been doing before.
It is. It is,
And so maybe, start there and maybe a little bit like, did you have any background in church history? Was it an interest for you, or was it like a total learning curve? Maybe just talk about some of that kind of stuff.
Okay, yeah. I have always had a certain amount of interest in church history. I think I'm like I had said previously, I'm always interested in people and stories, and I was the type of kid who, when they would tell stories about my ancestors, I actually was really into it instead of being those kids who are like, oh, mom and dad, like whatever, are pioneers, I was really interested in it. And the background of my ancestors meant something to me as a kid. I've also just been very interested in being Mormon and everything that makes up what this culture is. That I'm interested in the religious aspect of it, of course, but I'm also interested in all the stories. Again, there's so many stories. So I've always had a certain amount of interest in it. And when I wrote Bound on Earth, a little bit of what I did was just of my own family history research and some of the experiences and some of that ended up on the cutting room floor, but I was interested in that. And I was always interested, I remember being at BYU in the early 1990s and reading some articles. I don't even know how I came across them. They were from BYU studies, but they were like mimeographed and maybe something from Dialogue, as like an 18 or 19-year-old. about the priesthood restriction
Mm.
and just being like fascinated and also taken aback in some respects because there were things that I didn't know. And that feeling of like, I want to, but I really, really want to know. It's important to me to know. And sitting, I remember sitting in a family home evening and saying some of my family home evening brothers who were returned missionaries, and I assumed that they would know a lot more than I did about this. Like, did you know this about the priesthood restriction? Did you know this? And them like looking at me like I was like on the verge of apostasy and not knowing what to say to me. So I had always been interested in church history. And one other thing too, in high school, I was more into history than I was into English. And originally I was going to major in history. Um, I was now it's not a huge accomplishment because I went to Cypress High School out in Magnet, and so there wasn't a ton of competition, but I was the history Sterling Scholar
Oh,
um, at
yeah.
Cypress High School. But my teacher, Bob Jones, out there at Cypress High, he, those stories of people who kind of pluck you from where you were and try to put you where you need to go. He was that for me. I had been in one of his classes that was not an advanced class, and he read something I'd written, and I'd like done a test or something, and he was like, at the time I went by Angie, like, Angie, why are you not in AP? I'm like, well, I don't know. None of my friends are in AP. And I was kind of embarrassed. I didn't want to be seen as like too smart. It's a whole thing we could talk about. I'm sure
Yep.
all three of us had similar experiences as
Yep.
young women. Um, and he was like, no, 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 you're gonna be in AP, and moved me. And then he really mentored me through high school and into college. So that's also a big part of my past was that experience with history. So yeah.
Yeah. So did we come to you and recruit you, or how did you get involved in the
Okay.
project?
This is also a fun story, but also interestingly a really hard story. So I had been contacted when the church history department started writing saints. The original intention was to write saints, have the historians write saints. And I think the historians at the church history department are brilliant and can do all kinds of things that I cannot do. Um, but writing narrative was not something that most historians are trained to do. So as they started trying to write saints, it was like, okay, writing in scenes with point of view, for example, that's not something that you learn to do when you're getting your PhD in history.
Yeah.
And so they were looking around for writers to come help. And I was living in Minnesota at the time, and somebody had reached out to me. I think it may have been Steve Harper. I can't remember who. But Steve had reached out to me and said, would you, we've been given your name among a bunch of other names like Melissa Leilani Larson, who ended up on the project, Scott Hales, who ended up leading the project, James Goldberg, who ended up working on there were a bunch of us who all had an affiliation with the Association for Mormon Letters. So that's another like big shout out I want to give to the Association for Mormon Letters is that's how we all knew of each other was because of this. So I had been invited to interview for it, but then I told them, "Oh, I live in Minnesota." And they said, "Oh, never mind. Like you have to live in Utah," which makes sense. And I'm going to try to make this long story short, but um, so then I went on my way. I was teaching at the University of Wisconsin River Falls and teaching usually like 2 or 3 sections a semester. My kids were still at home. And during that time, my youngest was diagnosed with leukemia. It was very difficult, and his treatment necessitated that I was in the hospital with him a lot. And at that time, I got an email from Scott Hales, who I knew through the AML, and he said, "We have written this first draft of Saints, and I was wondering if you would be interested in reading it and just offering some of your perspective." And I said, "Sure, I'm just sitting here in the hospital. This will be something good for me to do." In the meantime, during a 2-week break in my son's treatment, we went on a vacation and I was riding a bike slowly and dumbly and was holding some sweatshirts, and the sleeve of the sweatshirt got caught in the spoke of the tire and I went over the handlebars and broke my arm.
Oh,
I broke my right arm. So I promise this is going somewhere. So I broke my right arm, and when the version of Saints that I was reviewing was one that they had this online form that you were supposed to type.
yeah,
And I said, I'm so sorry, I don't think I can do this because I can't type. But I can handwrite. I just can't type. And so Scott said, if you just want to handwrite some thoughts. So I did that. Then my son finished his treatment, and we went out to Utah to visit family. And I sent Scott an email and said, I have the manuscript with my handwritten notes. Do you want me to just bring it to you? What do you want to do? And he said, why don't you just come into the church history department and we can sit down and talk about it? And I was like, sure. So I came into the church history department to meet with Scott, and Steve Harper, who was in charge of the program of the whole project, happened to be there too. And so Scott said, hey, Steve, come in and talk to Angela a little bit. So I met him, and a couple days after that, I get an email from Steve saying, we have to completely redo volume 1. And Scott has some of this work that he's doing editing on volume 2. Would you be interested in just part-time doing some of this editing work, and we'll pay you for that, but part-time just editing work on volume 2 so Scott can work on volume 1. And at that point, my son was back in the hospital, and it was something that I could do while he was in the hospital. And as difficult and heart-wrenching as that time was in my life, it was the one thing that I could do that kind of kept my mind off of how difficult things were. I stopped teaching at that point, but I worked on saints, slowly but surely. And then after that, they ended up needing somebody full time, and they got special permission. This was before the pandemic. They got
yeah,
special permission for me to do it remote. And it's so funny to think of this. This is 2017, so it was just ahead of the pandemic. But at the church, they didn't even have like Zoom capabilities or anything. And I don't know if you remember this, Lisa, but they hired me to be in charge of literary editing on volume 4. And so I would have to call in to these meetings of everybody else is there in the room
yeah,
talking, and we just had a telephone. So they would put me on the telephone and I would try to participate in the meeting. So that's a very long story, but it's an important story to me because it's an example of how sometimes there are things in your life that happen that you never could have planned for in any way. I never could have planned to be involved in working on saints, and a bunch of different things kind of came together, and it was a real blessing in my life to be able to work on saints at the time that I did.
yeah. Yeah, I probably could have led off with this and talked a little bit about the other side of this story that you're telling, because when I joined the department in 2013, the Saints Project was underway, and there were a lot of people working on it. There were drafts being produced, and I was one of the people that was asked to review those.
Mhm.
And when there was a complete draft of volume 1, I think it was about 2016.
Yep,
That
that's what I was reading it.
Yeah, yeah. And like there's some specific things in my life that I can remember it ties to.
Mhm.
Um, and I wasn't a super sophisticated literary critic or anything, but it was really clear that this was not working.
Mhm.
And the project was kind of floundering,
Mhm.
actually, because of, Rick Turley had this vision for it. He wanted Michener quality, fiction style writing to tell the history. And so
Mhm.
vision of a literary aspect to the project was there from the beginning.
Mhm.
But as you pointed out, like it took somebody who knew literary vision
Mhm. Yep.
to come in and say, no, this is what's not working. This is why it's not working. And
Mhm.
this is what you need. And here are some suggestions. And from there, we started building this team of
Yes.
literary writers. And it was
Yes.
a really productive and fruitful partnership, I think,
Yes.
between the historians and the writers.
Yeah.
We both learned a lot from each other
Absolutely.
in the
Yep.
process of that. Say a little bit more about that, like how you see the overlap between your creative writing background and the history writing. What did
Mhm.
you have in common? What skills did you have to learn? What skills did you bring?
Mhm.
How, just talk a little bit about that relationship. And then
Yeah.
I'm going to have to drop off here in just a minute.
Yes.
So,
Yes. Yeah. First, Lisa, I remember the first time I met you in person. You had just come back from Hawaii and you brought everybody little cookies.
yes, that's right.
Uh-huh.
That's right.
And
Oh,
I
they,
was nervous. And it was also, I think, maybe I'm conflating these two dates, but it was the day at the church history department that they announced that women could wear pants.
uh-huh, that would be the year. Yep,
hmm
that
And
was,
and a bunch of women had gotten up and left and walked across the street to
yep,
the mall and bought
yep.
pants and came back.
Yep, yep.
Yeah.
For the record, I was not one of them, but
Okay.
I did acquire pants pretty quickly after that. Yeah, to
Okay.
wear
I
them.
just wanted to have that little
Just
walk down
like
memory
an
lane, but
epic in the history
yeah,
of church history. Yeah.
absolutely. I was there that day. Uh,
Yes.
I really think, first of all, I want to give a ton of credit to Scott Hales, especially because he was the one who they hired to be the one to try to wrangle it into some kind of literary shape. And I found when I came on the project that Scott and I seemed to understand each other's style pretty well. And so we clicked in that. Um, what I feel like I was able to bring as a writer was an understanding of how to build, first of all, at the scene level, how do you write a scene with a specific point of view? It is a tricky question to say, okay, here's all this historical information that we are trying that has to be 100% true and verifiable. You cannot say that it was raining or that someone frowned unless in the sources it was raining and someone frowned.
Okay.
So how do we make it literary, but you have very little leeway? You cannot make up any details. But then how do we also make it history, where not only are we helping to teach the history, but we're providing context,
Yeah.
even though we are in the present moment in a scene? That is really tricky. And it's actually probably the hardest writing I've ever done.
I
There
agree.
were times where it's like, okay, I have this one scene where I have to make it a scene with dialogue and characters who care about something, and it's moving forward not only the the action of that scene, but a greater arc throughout the whole book,
Yeah.
even though there are multiple point of view characters who are all interacting in different sub stories within the greater arc. It was a highly complex narrative task that even experienced storytellers would have a hard time getting their arms around because of all the different imperatives that we had layered on top of what we were trying to do. So I think that was what I was able to bring was a little bit more of an understanding of storytelling structure, how to write a scene, how to stay in point of view, how to use dialogue and detail in the right way. But then I had, historians like you, Jed Woodworth, Steve Harper, some of the other historians that I worked with on the team, who knew so much, just knew so much about the actual history and where to go. I didn't know how to do historical research to that extent. I'd done some research for my own writing and I taught research writing at the University of Wisconsin River Falls, But teaching that kind of writing to college sophomores who were majoring in, you know, agriculture is
Okay.
different than doing real historic research for a project like this. So I learned a ton about how to do research.
Talk about, this will be my last question, but talk about how do you use your imagination? Um, I don't know, differently? How do you deploy imagination for like a purely creative writing project? And then how did that transfer to using your imagination with historical sources to create characters?
Mhm.
So forth. When, like, as you mentioned, like we had this really constraining set of
Mhm.
imperatives about
Mhm.
how to tell the stories and how to use the sources and so forth.
Mhm.
And I, 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 I understand. I think what you're saying is right about the technical aspects of creating scenes and so forth.
Mhm.
I see the role for imagination in all of that.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, actually, Lisa. Thank you for asking that. Um, we only care about characters who want something.
Hmm.
It is boring to read about incidents and facts. We won't read that for very long,
Yeah.
but we will stick with people who care about things. And whether you want to use the term imagination or maybe a better term is a certain kind of empathy
Yeah.
that you have to have that ability in fiction writing to get inside a character, to be able to say, wow, what does this character want? And how do my readers feel what this character wants? And it was harder to do that on Saints just because we are so constrained. Imagination as far as, I couldn't even say that, she was sad unless she was sad. Um, just one quick little detail that is a fun one. One of the very first scenes I tried to write for Saints was Heber J. Grant's wife, Emily, who had been one of his plural wives, and it was during the raids, and it was a secret. It was supposed to be a secret that they were married, and his daughters didn't even know that he was their father. That Emily was letting one of her daughters, and she wrote fantastic letters. I loved working from Emily's point of view because she had feelings. So I was able to kind of get underneath her as a character. But there was a scene where in her journal she had said, I was nervous to let the girls go. They were going to go get in, like, if I remember right, it was like a little cart with a horse that was pulling it.
Yeah.
And that she was nervous to let them go because she never let them out of her sight. And so as a fiction writer, show don't tell is what you learn all the time. So instead of saying she was really nervous to let them go, I had put a detail in there like she held her hand tight and or like squeezed it tight before she let it go, which is what as a fiction writer I would want to say. And they were like, where in the sources does it say she squeezed her hand tight? There's nowhere in the sources. So it was a real challenge to work under those constraints, but that's where I tried to use my imagination is whenever I would find a character, the ultimate question was still, what does this character want? What does this character care about? What are the obstacles that this person is, so when it came to Emily, Emily was madly in love and always had been with Heber, and she ended up his third wife and had to go live all by herself in Manassas, Colorado with a bunch of cows. And it was so hard. And she missed him and she was kind of mad. And that is what allowed me to write about her with a little bit of liveliness instead of, oh, and then there were plural wives who had to move to Manassas.
Yeah.
Seeing it through her eyes allowed for some of that humanness to come through.
Well, I will just say, people aren't probably aware, but you were more or less the lead writer on volume three. I think you did a lot of the drafting and a lot of the writing on volume three.
I will say the second half.
The second half.
The
Okay.
second half. Yes.
Well, you did a great job. That I think now I'm biased because that one covers the period that I'm the most interested in.
Mhm.
But I just think the writing in volume three is just a little better than in the other volumes, and I think
Thank you,
you
Lisa.
deserve a lot of credit for that.
Thank you.
So,
I
all right.
also have to say the second half of volume three was also World War II.
Yeah.
And all you have to do is walk into any bookstore and know that writing about World War II is a pretty popular, it provides a lot of inherent conflict. So I was also
That is for
fortunate
sure. A lot of
to have
inherent
some of that.
interest. Yeah. Well, congratulations on this. I think it's wonderful, and I apologize that I have to duck out,
That's
but
okay. Lisa, it
I,
means so much to me that you're here, and I just want to thank you so much for being such a good friend and a mentor to me when I
yeah,
was at the church history department. And thank you for all the work that you do too, because you do really important work telling
thank
women's stories. So thank you for that.
I'm still bitter that you left, but I think you've done really great things, so it's okay. But
Okay.
yeah.
Thank you, Lisa.
All right. Thanks for letting me be part
Okay.
of it
Yep.
too.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
All right. Well, thank you to Lisa for that, but I still have questions, so we're not done yet. I was struck by your comment that the people who came together, at least on the writing side of Saints, originally loosely knew each other through
Mhm.
AML. And
Yep.
so I wanted you to talk to us a little bit about how you first became involved with the LDS literary community.
Yeah. So like Lisa alluded to, I found the AML list in the early 2000s, right when I had started my grad program in fiction, because I knew that I could publish a story in Sunstone, but the version of Angela in the early 2000s was too afraid of Sunstone to publish anything in Sunstone. I wouldn't be now, but that version of me was. And I knew that I could publish in dialogue, but I was a little afraid of dialogue because everyone seemed so smart who was involved in dialogue. So, and then I heard about Uriantum and it was like, oh, like, okay, and this is dedicated to Mormon literature. So I subscribed to Uriantum, and this was back when Chris Bigelow was doing Uriantum. Um, and my very, very first story that I was ever proud of was a story that I submitted to the Iriantum Fiction Contest and it won. And that of all the things I have ever done, I'm not kidding you, I think I was more excited when I found out that I won the Iriantum Fiction Contest than any other writing thing I've ever done. But it was just, it was this kind of validation that I think I was looking for, that I needed. So that kind of, I submitted to that. I won that contest. Then I subscribed to the AML list, and that's where I got to know you. Lisa was there too, but I also got to know you through the AML list. And I just want to tell a quick little Darlene story that at that time we were living in Minnesota, and then my husband had an opportunity to have a different job with the same company that would move us out to Utah. And I had never met Darlene. I just knew who she was online. And I had said something about like, oh, we're going to be moving to Utah. And Darlene immediately sent me an email and said, do you need somewhere to stay? You can come stay at my house if you're looking for houses. And I was just like, who is this hospitable, wonderful woman um, who would offer someone she has never met to stay at her house? And my parents lived there, so I didn't need to. But um, I just remember being so impressed by that and like, okay, Darlene needs to be my friend. So yeah.
Okay, so you placed won first place in the Ariantum contest,
Mhm.
and eventually you became editor of Ariantum. I mean,
Yes.
well, first you were fiction editor, and
Yes.
then at some point. So talk about that, and also I'm not sure of the timeline. You were also somewhere in there, editor, fiction editor for Segala,
Uh-huh.
right? And
Yes.
also you spent some time for BYU Study. So talk about your editing career just in terms
Yeah.
of a timeline.
Yes. So when I was still back in Minnesota, Chris Bigelow left Iriantum and Lorraine Wilkins took over Iriantum. And I cannot remember if she reached out to me or how it happened, but they needed a fiction editor, and I was happy to do it. So, and I think, this whole story of the Association for Mormon Letters and Iriantum and all of this is volunteer work, as we know, but it's also volunteer work that was extremely important to me and made a difference in my actual paid career. And I think you could probably say the same, Darlene, that that even though it was volunteer work, it was really important. And so I was working with Lorraine, and then there's tragedy in this story as well, because not long after we moved back to Utah, Lorraine was in a terrible car accident and passed away. And she was in the middle of an issue when she passed away. And so then I was able to kind of step in and help get that issue off to press. And then after that happened, I can't remember who asked me if I would be willing to take over. I mean, it must have been the board. I don't remember the details, but they asked me if I would take over as editor. So then I was editor in chief just on my own for a few years. And then there were a few others who came in and edited as well a few years after that.
Okay, and so where does your work for Segala fit into this timeline?
So Segala is actually through you, Darlene, because you knew Kathy Soper, who was the like Segala was her brainchild initially. And so you knew Kathy just because you guys lived in the same neighborhood, right? So I knew you, and then you introduced me to Kathy, and that's how I got involved with Segala.
Okay, and then
Yeah.
BYU Studies.
And BYU Studies, this is terrible, but I cannot remember who at BYU Studies asked me, but I ended up working as their book review editor for a few years.
Mhm.
Why don't I remember who asked me to do that? I probably should have looked that up. But I worked there as the book review editor, which was actually a really great opportunity to feel like I could talk about, or I could highlight Mormon literature for a broader audience, because sometimes the Association for Mormon Letters, we can also be a little insular. It's like we're our own little people that nobody really knows what's going on in our little world. And BYU Studies was a great opportunity to be able to say, here's some other things you might be interested in reading.
Yeah. So the work you did when you stepped in after Lorraine's accident was a big deal, and it really did save the magazine that was so important to so many of us. And you got, in 2006, you were given an award from AML for that. And I'm going to just take a second and read this citation as well. And I just need the audience to know, Angela has won 3 previous AML awards, and I'm reading the second one. I won't read the third one, but we'll talk about it in a second. But so this Lifetime Achievement Award is actually the culmination of previous awards. It would be her 4th. Okay, the Service to AML Award 2006. With the tragic passing of Lorraine Wilkins, Iriantum was left without a leader. Lorraine had begun to mold Iriantum into a literary and critical journal that she hoped would carry more and more weight within the realm of Mormon letters. Her loss left a lot of strings dangling, both in terms of her overall vision and goals, and also in the millions of material details that go into producing a journal. It was Angela Hallstrom, Iriantum's short fiction editor, who put her life on hold for several months in order to step in and pull off a miracle. Angela spent hours combing through Lorraine's notes and computer files, sleuthing out what plans Lorraine had made, whom she had contacted with promises to publish, and the printing procedures that were already partially in place. It was a monumental effort and resulted in one of our best issues yet. For her personal sacrifice, organizational and artistic skill, and great service to the Association for Mormon Letters, we wish to recognize Angela Hallstrom. And you were special features editor at Notes from 2004 to 2005, fiction editor in 2006, assistant editor in 2006, and editor from 2007 to 2010. So there you go. There's some dates. What do you, and we need to get to dispensations, and we will, but what do you, talk to me a little bit about what different skills go into being an editor than what you were using as your own creative writer as an author?
One of the things that really stood out to me is editing Iriantum was also, you had to have a certain ability to be organized, um, and to kind of contact people, gather people together. There's this very kind of very basic, not creative skill set that I think, and when I'm using the term editor in that respect, I mean editor as someone who is compiling and overseeing something that is being published, not necessarily a line editor of a piece. Um, so I think that was a really good education for me in learning how to connect people, how to organize things, um, how to stay on top of things. And it was my first experience, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's important. It was important as my in my development that as the editor of Iriantum, there were people that I really respected, like the late Eric Samuelson, for example, and a few other people who were writers that were professors at BYU. I really looked up to them. They were very talented and credentialed people, and men, most of them, that then I had asked to either participate in the contests, and we would come together and we would have like a roundtable discussion about the contests. And as the editor of the magazine, having these men who were Latter-day Saint men and who had greater rank than me, meaning they had PhDs, they were professors, I was not, that would come and sit in a circle with me and treat me as an equal was hugely important to me, to my development as a Latter-day Saint woman who also had a desire to be able to learn how to speak in certain circles. And I remember at that same time, I was also in a Relief Society presidency, and this was before the emphasis on how to run a council appropriately at the ward level, but that I had run a literary contest group with all of these people that I really admired, and there was so much equity and so much sharing of thoughts and ideas that was so great. And for whatever reason, in our ward, they would invite the whole Relief Society presidency to come to ward council. But I remember coming to ward council and having this feeling like I needed to keep my mouth shut and that I shouldn't overstep, and that the only thing that they were interested in really talking to the women about was what was on our calendar and what we were and were not allowed to do. And these were good men that were in the bishopric. They were just doing what had been modeled for them before. But having that experience of like, this is possible. This is possible for Mormons to interact with each other in this more equitable way. Anyway, I know that's a little bit of a tangent, but I do think it impacted my confidence and my ability to use my voice and feel like I had permission to use my voice.
Yeah. Okay, so talk about dispensation and how that came about.
So dispensation, I was working with Chris Bigelow at Zarahemla this time, and we felt that there was a need for another short story anthology. So Eugene England had published Bright Angels and Familiars back in the 90s, but there had been a lot of, and I think it was the early 90s when that was published, because I was in college when that was published. There was a lot of really good short fiction, by, for, and about Mormons that had been published since the turn of the 20th century. I'm sorry, the 21st century, that needed to be available, we felt, for people who were studying Mormon fiction. And so we decided to see if people would be willing to work on putting together that compilation, and we just jumped in and did it. And it was a great experience to be able to. I remember getting all these books of short stories, either from the library or if I could get them used, And I still had this image in my mind. I had this little office space that I would use when I would work. And just all over my floor, I had all these either collections from LDS authors, like Daryl Spencer, who I really admired, or Orson Scott Card, or and then all these magazines, all these Iriantum or Dialogue or Sunstone. By that point, I was reading Sunstone to read as much short fiction as I could to try to pick ones that I felt like um, would be a good fit for that book. And so it was really a great opportunity to be able to work on that.
So you talk about a good fit for that book. I'm interested in how an editor develops her own aesthetic of what makes a good story, a good Mormon short story.
Mhm.
And what talk a little bit about your aesthetic, either overall or at least what you were trying to achieve in that book. What your selections say about what you think makes a
Yeah.
good LDS short story.
What I was looking for is I wanted to find, first of all, good writing. Because I think often, especially back then, there was this feeling that all LDS literature was cheesy or clunky or poorly written. So first, good writing was really, really important. And then I wanted it to have most, not all of the stories, but most of the stories had something to do with the Mormon experience. But I didn't want it to be agenda driven. That was also really important to me. I didn't want there to be an agenda on either side, like I was talking about with my experience when I was at Hamlin. I didn't want them to be arguing for or against Mormonism. I wanted it to be about characters or about people, or if in the few stories that weren't explicitly Mormon, they were kind of implicitly Mormon, that they had elements about them that were influenced, that the writers were influenced by Mormon theology or ways of looking at the world.
So, um, a little time's gone by since that was published. What do you think, looking back, was its contribution to the field? And do you think it would be different now? Have things changed?
I definitely think it would be different now. I think church culture overall has undergone a pretty big shift in the last maybe since the mid 2010s. Because was this published in 2010 dispensation or
It
2011?
was 2010 is when it got the award, so that must have been
Okay,
the year it came out.
okay. Um, I think I think that conversations around what it means to be Mormon have changed quite a bit. I think there's actually more tension. I think I felt a little bit more freedom to kind of just say, oh yeah, we can all interact with this in a way that isn't super fraught. I feel like it's more fraught, even though my audience was still primarily people who had some kind of understanding about Mormonism. Um, Even if it was a college course that was not taught by a Latter-day Saint professor, or not at an LDS university, but maybe it was just a survey course about religious literature. I just things I don't know if I would have felt the same kind of freedom now that I did then, to imagine that there could be a kind of understanding and acceptance and inclusivity on all sides of the conversation. And hopefully that pendulum will swing back again. But
Yeah, interesting. So, what do you, if you dare take on this question, what do you see as the present and future of LDS Lit?
so I think it's really important that I say this. I have felt a little sheepish about this award because the past 5 years of my life, I participated in some judging and all of that, but I have not been actively as involved as I have been in the past, primarily because I decided to go back to school and become a marriage and family therapist. And that was quite an undertaking to go back to school. So my finger is not And now I'm working full time as a therapist. So my finger is not on the pulse quite in the same way that it was if you'd asked me this question back in 2019 or 2020. Um, However, I do think there is a lot more room broadly, and I am basing a lot of this off of my experiences now as a therapist. I think that average members of the church are more open to a variety of different interpretations of what it means to be Mormon or what the Mormon experience actually is. Now, that does mean that I think that there's more tension around it. I think there's more, it's more kind of in your face, these conversations. Um, but I don't think, like when Bound on Earth came out, I think there were two or three swear words and a couple of allusions to sex. And that the writer, there was somebody who did a little write-up in the Deseret book that mentioned somehow that it might be a little bit, I can't remember the words he used, but like it might be a little bit racy. And I was like, what? I don't know what would be racy about this. Um, and so I don't, while there were people who would have read Bound on Earth back in the late aughts, who I think might have been a little bit like, oh, this is pushing the envelope. I don't think that there would be quite so many people who would think that now. I don't know if that answers your question, but
Yeah, and where would you like to see Mormon Lit go? Do you see a bright future? And what do you hope to see?
I think one of the things that I hope to see is just more honesty and transparency in what it's like to be a human being, um, and more complexity, and less divisiveness and arguing a position, and more just okay, here's a wide variety of human experiences. So yeah. And I'll just put in a little, I'll just explain just briefly. I am working on a project right now that is nonfiction, that is kind of taking my three little parts of my life where I have this writer part and this history part, and now my therapist part. And I'm working on a nonfiction book about the experiences of Gen X LDS women that kind of takes all three of those aspects of who I am into account so that it's a little bit storytelling, it's a little bit research, it's a little bit what in the world do we do? How do we deal with all of this? So I'm in the middle of working on it, and I wish I could work on it faster, but um,
I do too. I am so looking forward to this book. I think you've tapped into a really unique generation that they're the stories to tell about. I mean, granted, this is my age, so I'm
yeah,
super interested, but there's
yeah.
so much to say about the cultural changes in the church and the way it has affected Mormon women.
Mhm.
And I'm super excited about this book. And
Yeah.
might we see a return to some fiction in your future as well? Or do you think you're going to
I,
head
you
towards non?
know, I would never rule that out because I love fiction. I just have not, I really have not written a whole lot of fiction, even during the time that I was working for the church history department, because I worked for the church history department from 2016 to 2021. And that was very intense. So all of my writerly energy kind of went into that. But I also learned a lot about nonfiction writing by doing that. Um, so that's kind of led into the project that I'm working on now. But I could definitely see myself going back to fiction again. If I
Great.
stop like going back to school and starting new careers and all that other stuff.
Yeah. Which brings me to what I think would probably be my last question. I love that you've reinvented yourself and you have this new career, and I imagine you're fantastic at it. And do you see any connections or any strengths that you bring to this new work as a therapist that come from your background in stories?
Yeah, I think it's all very connected. It's all just people and their stories, their conflicts, their desires, the here am I, how do I get to here? We're all just, we are all the protagonists of our own story. And one of the wonderful things I love about therapy now, there's even a kind of therapy that's called narrative therapy that really leans into this idea that our lived experience is a narrative. As human beings, we put things together in our mind as a narrative, and that we have the power to decide whether the narrative we are living by is one that we are choosing. And we don't have to choose narratives that are imposed on us. We have the power to re-envision our narrative based on the same facts. And that was, I think, one of the really most interesting things about working on Saints was that idea too, of when I was writing fiction, I got to make up whatever I wanted. But when I was working on Saints, it was like, okay, well, here's all these facts. Let's put them together into a story. That is what human beings do. But the details that we choose and what we emphasize and what we let go of, what seems to be the central conflict and what is not, that is all up for grabs, really. And so I see a great deal of resonance between all three of the careers that I've been fortunate enough to be able to participate in.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for spending time doing this. I learned some new things about you. And I think it's really clear to everybody why, I mean, this is the definition of a lifetime of achievement. Your work as a creative writer on your own, your work as an editor, gathering and fostering great writing among others, and your work as a, I know what we call it, an institutional historical writer for Saints. You have contributed much to the LDS literature community, and I'm so glad I get to know you as a friend and as someone I can look up to in terms of achievement. And I'll turn the time over to Andrew.
Thank you so much, Darlene.
Thank you so much, both of you. I've loved listening to all about Angela's career and reliving some of the things I've been reliving. I've been rereading Bound on Earth, and I encourage everybody to go get it and read it if you haven't already. And Dispensation and Saints, a wonderful body of work. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you. It means a lot.